These videos are based on my book called Intergalactic Resettlement, Meet the New Neighbors. I am writing this book to share with you my paranormal experiences and to introduce you to the Intergalactic Resettlement program. It is my hope that this information will comfort those with similar experiences and inspire others to open their minds to alternative realities which benefit humankind. In 2017, my spiritual guides told me that it was time to come out of the closet and make public my ET experiences and the knowledge I received as a result. My goal is not to convince anyone about my truth, but rather to educate those who are open to this information. It is important to note that I do not represent the beings from the Intergalactic Resettlement Program in any way, and I am not their spokesperson. I only speak to what I know and experience for myself. I've been encouraged by my spiritual guides to provide information so that people can make up their own minds about the options they may choose from for dealing with future world events. The Intergalactic Resettlement Program may become an option when our physical planet is in crisis or transitioning, making it not safe to live here anymore. With all of the exopolitical contact that we hear about, it is important for you to know that I am not part of any Earth-based group, religion, politic, or philosophy, and I am not part of the secret space program. I wish to stress that there is nothing to be afraid of. These off-world beings are absolutely benevolent and loving. They have a do no harm mandate, and they do not interfere with human free will. Further, I do not know species or racial names, planet names or group names, and my ET friends are not from any specific star system. This is an unorganized, frequency-based movement. When we are ready and reach out spiritually, contact commences. For those of you who don't know, my name is Karen Holton. I'm a shamanic guide, a spiritual coach, and I have a talk show called The Quantum Guide Show, available on YouTube and Odyssey, and Forbidden Knowledge News and other social media platforms. The Intergalactic Resettlement Program, Meet the New Neighbors. Today, I'm going to cover some information from the book that I'm writing. It's Chapter 2, Part 1, and it's about my background. So I'll be reading a little bit from my book and elaborating on the information as well today. So thank you for joining me. Hold on to your hats. I have an interesting background, and it will soon become apparent as to why I have these kind of experiences. So Chapter 2, Part 1, Background, my intergenerational contact. My maternal grandmother was a healer and a midwife, and she was also a contactee. And my mother was an alternative healer, and she had some psychic abilities, but if she had ET contact, she sure wasn't telling. And then there's me, and I experience clairaudience, precognitive memory, other psychic abilities, as well as angelic and extraterrestrial contact. So it kind of goes back, as far as I know, it goes back to my maternal grandmother. And I think that she was altered on some kind of a genetic level so that she could maintain ongoing ET contact. Back in the early 1900s, Grandma was raised as a child in an isolated logging camp in Eastern Canada, where she made friends with invisible beings. So she had no other children to play with, and she didn't have school or anything like that. So while everybody was working in the lumber mill and working on the wood and all that kind of stuff, and meal preparation, and God knows how many chores there were back in those days, Grandma would go off out into the woods. And one day she came back and she said she had found some amazing friends. And so she would go every day into the woods and she would hang out with her friends. And what's interesting is that she maintained a close telepathic connection to her friends throughout her life, to the point where she had little use for social human contact outside of her immediate family. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, Grandma was able to, through paranormal experiences, have conversations or clairaudience with these ET people. And I think some of the family just kind of thought she was a bit of a nutter, but she worked very hard. She had a very large family, and she spent all her energy looking after her family. But what was interesting is because she had these friends that no one else could see or really knew about, she didn't have any use for hanging out with friends socially within her community. So she wasn't interested in getting involved with, the coffee clutch or whatever. She just stuck to herself, and the amazing healing things that she just knew, are also evidence that she had contact with another realm or beings. We're not really sure. And I was too young once she passed away to really understand these things or be able to talk to her about it. So that was back in the 1900s when she was a child, and she was isolated from basically everything out in this logging camp in Eastern Canada. So a bit more about my grandmother. She was an amazing woman. What I really liked about her is she wasn't afraid to fart out loud. I came from a family that was very anal retentive, and there was no way we would get punished if we burped or we farted. And I really laughed my head off when my grandma she would just let it rip whatever she wanted to, no matter where she was or what she was doing. And I always thought that was really, really funny. But besides her letting it rip, my grandmother had intuitive ways of knowing, and she was well known for her natural healing abilities. And she never charged money for helping other people. She just felt that it was something that she should do, and she did it. And one day, there was a neighbor who was in a body cast because he was recovering from back surgery. And he was really suffering. He was in so much pain, he just couldn't stand it. And he would moan and groan, and the whole neighborhood was disrupted from his constant groans of agony. And my grandmother's heart went out to him, and she just knew what she needed to do. So, back in these days, my grandma and her children and my grandpa lived in very small communities, often out in farms, things like that. And everybody knew how to hunt because that was how they got their meat and a lot of their food besides their gardens. And so my mom told me this particular experience, that she said that her mother, which is my grandmother, she sent a couple of my uncles out to kill a skunk without disturbing it. And what that means is, skunks will give off a horrible, horrible spray of stink if you disrupt them. And so my uncles had to somehow figure out a way to capture and kill a skunk without having it release its stink. And after they killed it, they brought the stink sack to my grandmother, and she cooked it up in a great big pot with other ingredients like herbs and fat. And then she fashioned a really large swab out of a stick and a rag wrapped around the end of it, making it like a giant sized Q-tip. And she took these over to treat the suffering neighbor. So apparently Grandma dipped the swab into the solution, and she stuck it down the back of the man's cast and coated his back with this concoction. And it brought him so much relief that he could finally sleep, and he had relief from that terrible pain, and the neighborhood was kind of quiet again. So Grandma's potion was the only thing that helped to ease his suffering. No one knew how she was able to come up with her healing herbs and her concoctions, since she had very little education. She had no training, formal training whatsoever, and very little schooling. But I strongly believe that Grandma's invisible friends helped her to know. My mom said that also what grandma used to do is if any of them had a stomach ache or a headache or a rash or anything like that, grandma would take that child out into the field, because there was very few houses in the area, lots of wild plants, and have the person, or I should say the child who needed the assistance, to help pick certain specific herbs. And grandma would bring the child and the herbs back home again. And I guess child would be more like my uncles and my aunts. And she would then brew a tea, and they would drink the tea, and it worked every single time. So they never really had need of doctors or any kind of medical care whatsoever. And then, of course, there was a local doctor who would come make his rounds. He didn't really live in that community, but he would make his rounds visiting the different communities, sort of taking care of women who were close to giving birth. And he had my grandma come with him when it came to delivery time, and she delivered the babies. And after a while, she was able to do that really, really well, even without any kind of doctor being present. And so my grandma was, really, really well known as a healer. And of course, the idiosyncrasy of talking to people that nobody else could see. So I also believe that my mother was either changed genetically or she carried the altered genes from her mother. Now, my mother, I'll tell you a little bit about this first. Although the paranormal subject really freaked my mom out, she couldn't handle talking about anything paranormal. It couldn't talk about anything that, wasn't very three-dimensional and solid in front of my mom. But what's interesting is my mom often displayed advanced psychic skills and ways of knowing and ways of healing that just came to her. She just knew how to do that. And she used these ways of knowing as an alternative healing practitioner. And this is around the 1980s, 1990s. And she helped many, many people without any monetary charge. So I can remember coming, when I was staying with her as an adult, I remember coming home and the living room was full of people, and there's people lined up out the driveway to the sidewalk, people waiting to get in to see my mom. They came from all over the United States, Canada, to see my mom, and my mom helped heal every single one of them. My mom never charged money for that either. She would allow donations. For instance, someone might buy her a beautiful scarf or bring her a gift or a plant, and that was fine with my mom. She never made people pay for the services that she had. Of course, she was fairly well off by this time and didn't really need the money. She just was more interested in helping people, much the way her mother was. So another little thing I want to add is that my mother and my stepfather had plans to aggressively move up the social ladder. That was so important to them. But they knew that this would be impossible if she was ever tagged with a mental illness disorder. She feared losing her social imagined status more than losing her spiritual gifts, so she kept them very well hidden. And if you listen to the last episode of these podcasts, chapter 1, I get into the medical industry and how it overlapped with the social norms of society, and how people were treated when they did openly talk about their paranormal experiences. And so that was something that Mom never told anybody about anything that was what she would call weird, because she didn't want to take a chance on losing her social position. Anyway, more about that another time. So I believe that my grandma was genetically altered, which made ET contact easier for the successive generations. I also have a niece who is very in tune with ETs since childhood. So she used to wake up in the morning and she would do these amazing detailed diagrams, and she knew languages that were not spoken here on Earth. And all of this came to her while she was sleeping. And she has intuitive ways of knowing. Today, she's got great, very enhanced psychic abilities, and she works as an energy healer. So again, this seems to be an intergenerational situation. And I don't know. I guess once we're changed, and our children are born with the gifts as well. It's quite interesting. So I want to speak a little bit about my birth father, who is obviously not the same as my stepfather. And he was a very unusual person. And I think he may have had ET contact, although I actually never got to see him after I was 4 years old. But after he was divorced by my mother, he hand built a tiny little sailboat called Thumbelina, and he set off to sail around the world. Now, my dad did that just by looking at the stars. He had no charts, he had no equipment, no technology to help him. And here he set off from Vancouver, BC, in this little tiny boat that he had built himself absolutely from scratch. And so he sailed from Vancouver, BC, Canada, and he went to New Zealand. He went to Fiji, and then he ended up in Japan. And in Japan, he's actually known as a bit of a hero because the part of the culture is to honor people who have done great feats at sea. Like, for instance, traveling from Canada all the way, to Fiji and New Zealand, and then Japan. That was pretty amazing, especially in this tiny, tiny little boat, and without any kind of technology or equipment that he was able to find his way. So unfortunately, one day he and his little boat went missing off the coast of Japan, interestingly, in the area within the Dragon's Triangle. So you know how we have the Bermuda Triangle? There's several triangles on the Earth, and they all have these weird, I don't know, geological, energetic abnormalities. Anyway, my dad's and his little boat or ship, I'm not sure, I guess it's a boat when it's that small, little sailboat, just disappeared. Just boom. One minute he was on the radio, and the next minute he was gone. They never found any trace of him. They never found any trace of his boat, and nobody ever saw him or heard from him again. So no trace of him or his boat were ever found. And what is kind of cool about this is Thumbelina was the name of the book that he used to read to me when I was a very young child. Now, how do I know about what happened to my birth father? Because I hadn't seen him since I was 4. My paternal grandmother sent me news clippings. And that's how I found out basically what happened to my birth father. I thought that was pretty interesting too. So due to my family history, I believe that I have the genetics for ET communication, and this multi-generational component made me a very good candidate for much contact. And there is also a possibility that my grandmother or my mother or me or all of us are hybrid beings. I don't know. I don't have any information to support that, but intuitively it feels right. So some of us are ordinary people who have extraordinary experiences, and I believe we all share the potential for ET contact. I don't think contactees are special. We have some genetics that have been altered, and many of us have experienced trauma, which gives us the ability to dissociate, and it causes changes to the brain's receiver wavelength, and we become empaths, and we become very good psychic receivers. So you'll see that over and over and over again. People who have amazing gifts often have gone through some of the roughest conditions you could ever imagine while alive here on planet Earth. So now I'm going to talk a bit about conditions that prepared me for advanced ET contact. So when my mother was pregnant with me, they came out with a drug called thalidomide, which was supposed to relieve morning sickness. My mother had very severe morning sickness when she was pregnant with me. So she took the drug because she was told it was safe and effective. And unfortunately, it wasn't until about, I don't know, the 1960s that they found out that it caused pretty severe birth defects. And so I'm not going to use the term that they used back then because it's not very nice or accurate. But basically, these babies were born sometimes with no arms, sometimes with no legs, sometimes with no arms or legs. And miraculously, I was born with arms and legs, even though my mom took that drug. But you know what? I sense that there's something different about me as a result. I've just intuitively known all my life. And I don't know if it's changes in chemistry, biology, like I don't know, but I do feel, and I've always felt that there's something a little bit different or weird about me. Then I experienced periods of isolation and trauma, which allowed me to develop my gifts. So we often look at the traumas we've had as things that hold us back, that are things that disable us mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. But I believe, based on my own experience, that these traumas actually left us in a state to learn how to overcome them. And also, somehow it just seems to give us special gifts. I'm not saying it's worth it. I think trauma is a horrible thing, but I do think that when we work our way through it and out, we end up with some pretty amazing talents. So in my case, when I was only 3 months old, I developed spinal meningitis and polio, which led to 6 weeks of isolation in the hospital with almost no contact from my mother. You see, my mom was raised without any running water or any plumbing of any kind. They just had an outhouse. Any water they had to be carried quite far from a well, and it was very heavy. My mom and her sister were the ones that hauled the water every day, but you didn't want to use any more than you had to. And as part of the culture, they were not into taking a lot of baths. Once a week was about all you got. My mom said that my grandma would heat up the water and put it in a huge basin, and she'd start by washing the babies, and she'd work all the way up, and my grandpa was the last one that had his bath in the same water. So anyway, when it came to having me, all the previous generations had been breastfed, but the thinking of the day was that the bottles and formula were better for the baby than breast milk. So my mom had bottles and stuff, and she didn't even know really how to keep them clean. I got very, very sick, and I ended up with both spinal meningitis and polio. I was lucky that I don't have more impairments than what I do, but they definitely had an effect on me and made my life more challenging for sure. So the thing is back in those days too, the hospital environment was pretty brutal. So they put me in isolation, and I didn't get anybody to cuddle me or love me or anything like that for 6 weeks, which is a really, really long time for a little 3-month-old baby. But worse than that, they were experimenting with some of their new, I was going to say toys, but actual, their tools that they were using, that they were just inventing, that were just coming out at the time. And so they were really crazy to do a lot of spinal taps on pretty much everybody, especially those who had high fevers and had symptoms of meningitis or polio. And so my mom knows of at least twice that they did spinal taps on my tiny body. And she knows because she had to sign for that procedure, and they convinced her that that was absolutely necessary. And I don't know if it's because of the meningitis or because of the polio or because of the spinal taps. I've had a lot of body pain all my life, so it makes it difficult to concentrate and makes it difficult for me to do things that are easy for other people. And but I believe that this was my opening up point to universal consciousness in order to survive. And indeed, I did survive. You see, as babies, humans and other mammals need consistent daily love and affection in order to survive. And this bonding process with mother or another significant being is an essential component which enables attachment. And we need that in order to be well emotionally. Through this process, we form a mental and emotional framework to build on. Lack of healthy human contact is a major contributor to infant mortality. And I believe that unseen beings provided the stimulation which enabled me to survive, experience lifelong paranormal contact, and an alternative reality. I had to have been getting love from someplace, or I wouldn't have survived. Or at least I wouldn't have survived as intact as I am because of it. Another thing that happened is I've always had these ability to do these things that nobody else was talking about, or at the time, as far as I knew, that anyone else was doing. So when I was a young woman, I knew that that when I was a baby, I was in trouble, definitely when I was in the hospital. So I actually energetically traveled back in time and I ministered to myself as a baby. Now, I don't have clear memories of that, but I do know that after I did that, I just started to have a little bit better success at life. So I actually went back through kind of my own personal guided meditation and saw myself, you know, in the bassinet, picked myself up, cuddled me, told me that I loved me, and then would put me back. And I would do that, you know, several times over the next few days to, I don't know, just because I just knew to do that. Then later, after I was in foster care, and because of my experiences in foster care, I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. But when I was in foster care, after I came back to my mom from being in foster care, which was about 6 months, I was absolutely terrified of the dark, and I had trouble breathing beneath the covers where I hid. And one night, a fiery griffin appeared to me and made it clear that it was there to stand on guard and protect me from anything nefarious while I slept. I called on it telepathically whenever I felt terrified at night, and it would always appear. I did not find this out until because I didn't know what a griffin even was, didn't even know there were such things as griffins. And, you know, in modern science, I guess they would say there's no such thing, but I didn't know anything about them. And then later, when I was in my 20s, you know, about the same time that I was doing that work, going back and ministering to myself as a baby in the hospital, I actually came upon a picture of it in a book, and I recognized it absolutely immediately. So I thought that was pretty cool. So I remember being in my bed, absolutely terrified, under the covers, couldn't breathe, and I just call out to my fiery griffin. It literally looked like it was on fire. And I knew as long as it was there, I was safe. And it really helped a lot. So going back again to my life at age 4, my younger brother and I spent 6 months in an abusive foster care home, followed by my mother's remarriage to a sadistic man who was unable to empathize and thought that compassion was for wimps. I'm not sure how much to talk about what happened to me when I was 4. I was 4 and my brother was 2. And we were there for 6 months, and it was really friggin' horrible. When you hear about some of the things that are happening to children today, you know, how they're being exploited, how they're basically part of a slave trade network, how terribly they're being abused. Those children, first of all, this has been going on for a very long time on planet Earth. And those children grow up to be adults. And myself and my brother are 2 of the people who grew up after experiencing these horrible, horrible things. Now, I know it could have been worse, probably could have been a lot worse because we survived, but at the same time, it was bad enough. And then it was very shortly after that my mom married my stepfather. There's a whole story about that I'm not going to get into in my book, and I'm not going to get into here, but when I'm ready, I will share my experience. And but suffice to say that my stepfather, he was sadistic, And he knew how to do mind control and mind control techniques. And he was basically the handler for my mom. I know it ties into the Nazi movement. It ties into all kinds of weird stuff, MK Ultra, but I'm just not going to get into it because I don't really have it fully sorted out within myself yet. But he basically couldn't empathize and thought that compassion was for wimps. In his way of thinking, in order to teach us as quickly as possible, he inflicted much abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, a lot of humiliation, shaming. It was pretty darn bad. And this resulted in much stress and insecurity throughout my childhood. And later, when I was 15 years old, my parents moved to another province without me. And since I couldn't provide for myself and did not have any adult skills, I was preyed upon by strangers and again, severely abused. And this resulted in further significant trauma. So again, I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't want you to pity me. I don't want you to think differently of me. I just want you to know that through time and effort and spirituality, I have been able to work through these experiences. And I absolutely believe that while I was undergoing them, I had no choice but to turn to internal resources, unseen forces for help and support so that I could survive. And survive, indeed, I did. I always answered back with one statement: I cannot, because I'm surrounded by rock and I'm afraid to come out. Sorry, it's been intense for me to even tell you about this because, but anyway, I'll just continue on. It's an amazing, amazing vision that I had. So the little girl in the vision said, I cannot because I'm surrounded by rock and I'm afraid to come out. And that's mostly it. But I also saw several holographic images of myself as a toddler. And later, when I asked my mother or described how I had seen myself to my mother, she was shocked. She absolutely remembered the little yellow dress, the little black shoes, and she was astounded that I could remember this and more. And this was one example that proves that my experiences are very real. So this was a metaphor. Most of my visions are in metaphor. And then it's sort of up to me to glean the meaning or the message. And sometimes as I go through time, gleaning the message from one particular vision, I'm surprised to find out I'm able to unfold more and more and more meaning, and it really helps me in my life. So the rock mass represented an enormous burden, the burden of my trauma, and the severity of the emotional impairment that I developed for my own defense. And the fairy represented the spiritual forces that encouraged me to move past these life-altering events and to emancipate my authentic self. Only by smashing through the rock mass could I set myself free. And this was no easy task. And it's actually taken the rest of my life to actually make this happen so that I could be free. I gained great insight into myself as a result, and over the years since, I've come to see the vision differently and through many different perspectives and narratives, and it's really served me well. Such is the nature of visions. They are transformative, and I'm so glad I have them. Working through trauma is what has elevated me. The working our way through it reveals the gifts of forgiveness and compassion. Every trauma becomes a blessing as we heal. We become outstanding empaths. I learned that my experiences provide the perfect fertile soil for me to bring in my own inner resources. We go inside in order to go outside. We are fractal holograms. We are perceived as a part, but we carry the whole. We can access anything and everything by going within. Yeah, Thanks for bearing with me. I get a bit emotional sometimes when I'm telling my experiences because they're very, very real for me. I don't care if people believe me or not. Sometimes I get comments below my videos saying, nope, I'm not buying into what you're saying. My experience is different. Great, not a problem. But yeah, it's really, these are truly, truly my experiences. And they've changed me in ways I can't even describe. So let's talk a little bit about my childhood contact. So my paranormal experiences started when I was a child. I felt really stressed out by social groups and I preferred to be alone. I had my own reality where I felt connected to nature. I was always a very, very sensitive child. I'm now a very sensitive old lady. All my life, I've been very, very sensitive, and it's very difficult for me to be around crowds, and even going shopping in supermarkets full of people or Costco is very, very difficult, and I find it exhausting. But this is the way I came into this world to be this way, and so this is how I am. And I always felt super connected to nature. I could communicate with bugs and flowers and all kinds of things. I had the most amazing experiences. This only happened when I was alone. I never really felt safe unless I was alone. So as I mentioned, this led to my communication with bugs, plants, and animals, and I was open to contact with other realms. I totally believed in fairies and in angels and other beings because I had had experiences with them. These were benevolent, unseen beings who brought me so much comfort and wisdom and just took care of me, and I'm so grateful. My spiritual guides have always been with me and they kept me company. I don't physically see them, but I am aware, I am aware that they are always with me. Also, as a child, I regularly experienced missing time, and this continued into adulthood. I had the habit of missing social engagements and lost the favor of friends and family as I couldn't account for the time, where I was, or what I was up to. I had no explanation. It was funny. It would often happen to me as I was getting ready to go out to a social event. I remember so many times, several times, sitting on the edge of my bed, putting on my socks, getting ready to go out. And of course, going out causes me a bit of anxiety, and boom, I'd be gone. And the next thing I know, here I am sitting on the end of my bed, putting on my socks, and 4 hours has gone by. How do you explain that to other people? So they just kind of thought I was a bit of a deadbeat and didn't show up to stuff, but that wasn't it at all. I received loving support from my spiritual guides in the form of lucid dreams and spontaneous knowing. Whenever I tried to tell my mom or my family about it, they admonished me and said that I had an overactive imagination and I shouldn't be talking like that because people were going to think I was crazy. My parents were very concerned about what other people thought about us and our social standing, which was pretty common at the time, maybe still really common today. I don't know. I also had some special abilities, but my family told me they weren't real and I should stop talking about it. Every day, every time I came in and started telling my mom about stuff, I'd get in trouble because I was not supposed to be talking like that. And it was like they kept training me and trying to train me all the time to make it go away or make me stop. But, I couldn't stop. This was my reality. This was my life. So I stuffed my paranormal experiences down deep. And I always knew that there was so much more to life. And since I was spiritually minded, I joined various religions over the years to find explanations for my experiences. Unfortunately, the ministers, the priests, the pastors, they all taught me that this type of experience was from the demons, and I was strongly discouraged from ever talking about it. In some ways, that hasn't changed in mainstream society today. I had a really cool experience happen to me when I was in my late teens. This is around 1973. I had an experience with my younger brother, Dan. Dan is the brother who he and I shared the abusive foster home together. So we had quite a bond between us. And we were both receiving ET communications while we slept. And these communications were remembered as vivid dreams. Dan and I had the same experience, which doesn't surprise me, as Dan and I are from the same mother and the same father. My other siblings and I share the same mother, but we have different fathers. So in this vision, or in these dreams, or whatever you want to call them, we were invited to join off-world beings on a physical spaceship to another world. And I wasn't talking about this because I thought I was imagining it. That's how I coped with all my experiences. I mean, I was told, oh, you can't talk about that. Oh my God, or getting punished or worse. I just kept thinking I had an overactive imagination because that's what I was constantly being told. And that I was maybe even, it was insinuated that I was even a troublemaker for inventing these kind of stories. But so anyway, when this happened, I wasn't talking about it to anybody. And the next time I saw Dan, surprise, surprise, he confessed that he was also having the very same invitation and experience. We decided to go, but the night we were supposed to leave, we both received vivid dreams that we should not go because something was wrong with the situation. I don't know any of the details. The next day, Dan told me that there was a terrible accident and some of our off-world friends were actually killed. And that's all I know. I kept listening for ET contact back then, but there was only silence for a number of years. And yeah, I was kind of disappointed. I don't know, I liked my freaky experiences. Then shortly after the first ET encounter, my brother and I hopped the trains to Calgary, Alberta to visit his girlfriend. It's interesting. She was one of Canada's top 10 artists, and her name was Gina, or actually her original name was Gerda Christofferson. Gina was also a mystical intuitive, and one day, as we gathered in a hotel dining room with her two grown children, Monty and Nisha Christofferson, Gina revealed some startling information. Apparently, Gina, Monty, Nisha, Dan, and I were there at this very point in time due to divine arrangement. Gina claimed that we were of the Brethren of the White Light, and we were here to fix the timeline and anchor in divine light and frequencies. So back in the 70s, you heard a little bit of talk like that, but not too much. Anyway, I was always grateful for my wonderful experiences and the time I got to spend with Gina and her family. I had no idea what this meant at the time, but in hindsight, Gina Christofferson was spot on with her prediction. That's it for this podcast. I encourage you to, if you haven't done so already, go and watch the video called Chapter 1, Clarification. And I also have a little intro video that I've also put out before that. And if you haven't done so, definitely watch the previous video, Chapter 1. And next time we're going to be exploring Chapter 2, Part 2, My Paranormal History. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you again soon.